This is a homily for the feast of the Epiphany. The first reading is from the prophet Isaiah, chapter 60, verses 1 to 6. The responsorial psalm is from Psalm 71. And the Gospel for this Sunday comes from the Gospel of St. Matthew, chapter 2, verses 1 to 12. To download the text of this homily as a PDF file, go to sundayhomilies.au. Let's begin by asking what our English word Epiphany means. Like many English words, Epiphany comes from Greek. The Greek noun is epiphania. This noun is derived from the verb epiphaino. The verb epiphaino is formed from the preposition epi, which can mean upon, on, over, or forth, and the verb phino, to shine, to appear, or to bring light. So quite literally, the word means to shine upon or to bring into appearance. From this, the noun epiphania carries the sense of manifestation, appearance, shining forth, or revealing presence. The verb epiphaino accordingly means to appear, to shine forth, to reveal, or to make manifest. In Greco-Roman usage, epiphania referred to the visible appearance of a deity, a sudden manifestation of power, the arrival of a king, or the saving intervention by a god or a ruler. It is a word that combines light, revelation, and decisive action. Something or someone breaking into human experience in a way that cannot be missed. St. Paul uses epiphania 5 times. Once in his first letter to Timothy, 3 times in the second letter to Timothy, and once in the letter to Titus. Paul takes a word that in the ancient world referred to the appearance of a god or the arrival of a king, and he applies it boldly to Jesus Christ. In the second letter to Timothy, chapter 1, verse 10, he speaks of Christ's first epiphany, his coming in the flesh to destroy death and bring life. In the other 4 passages, Paul looks forward to Christ's final epiphany, his glorious return when he will judge the living and the dead and reveal the fullness of God's kingdom. The English word epiphany enters the language in the early 14th century, appearing around 1310 as a proper noun, designating exclusively the Christian feast of the Epiphany on the 6th of January. In Middle English sources of the 14th to the 16th centuries, the term Epiphany invariably refers to the liturgical commemoration of Christ's manifestation to the Gentiles in the visit of the Magi, and secondarily to his manifestation at the baptism and at Cana. By about 650, Epiphany appears with a lowercase e and refers to other manifestations of Christ and to appearances of divine beings in other religions. A further broadening occurs in the 19th century when Epiphany develops a figurative, psychological and literary sense. The term is then widely used to describe a sudden moment of revelation, insight, or perceptual breakthrough. From this point onward, the metaphorical and secular usage becomes well established in English, while also retaining the original liturgical sense of the word. So on this feast of the Epiphany, we meet wise men from the East. Who are they? Let's do some detective work. The Greek word translated as wise men is magos in the singular or magoi in the plural. That's where we get the word Magi from. It is also the Greek word from which we get our English word magician. In the ancient world, this word didn't carry the sense of magician the way that we use it today. Rather, it referred to people who studied the stars, interpreted dreams, and tried to read the signs of God's activity in the world. In our time, we separate astronomy from astrology, science from superstition, but in the ancient world these things were woven together. The heavens were seen as a kind of divine script, and those who studied them were believed capable of recognizing when something world-changing was happening, such as the birth of a king. The word magos comes from Persia, where the Magi were members of the priestly caste of Zoroastrianism, a religion that treasured wisdom, moral purity, and attentiveness to the movements of God. By the time Matthew wrote his Gospel, the word magos had broadened. It could refer to genuine seekers of truth, but also to charlatans, deceivers, and tricksters. The New Testament reflects this range of meaning. In Acts 13, for example, Paul and Barnabas encounter Elymas, whom Luke also calls a magos, but in a very negative sense. Paul and Barnabas are proclaiming the word of God on the island of Cyprus. Luke tells us that at Paphos they encountered a magician and Jewish false prophet called Elymas bar Jesus. He was with the proconsul Sergius Paulus. The proconsul had summoned Barnabas and Paul because he wanted to hear the word of God. However, Elymas bar Jesus kept opposing them, seeking to turn the proconsul away from the faith. Luke then tells us that Paul, filled with the Holy Spirit, looked intently at bar Jesus and said, "Son of the devil, full of all kind of trickery and villainy, enemy of all righteousness, will you not stop twisting the straight paths of the Lord? Now see how the hand of the Lord is against you. You will be blind, not seeing the sun for a time." The word that Luke uses to describe Elymas bar Jesus is magos. The Magi we meet in today's Gospel were quite different. They were searching for the truth, searching for the true God. Where did the Magi come from? Matthew simply tells us they came from the east. His Greek phrase is apo anatolon, which literally means from the rising, that is, from the rising of the sun, hence from the east. But where exactly? Matthew doesn't say, and I suspect he would be amused by our centuries-long attempts to pinpoint their exact homeland. There was certainly no consensus among early Christian writers. Great scholars such as Clement of Alexandria, John Chrysostom, Leo the Great, and Cyril of Jerusalem believed the Magi came from Persia. This tradition is reflected in the famous mosaic in the Basilica of Sant'Apollinare Nuovo in Ravenna. Inside that basilica we find a 6th century mosaic of the wise men. The Magi are shown wearing unmistakably Persian clothing. And you'll notice something else. By the 6th century, they have already been given the names of Balthasar, Melchior, and Gaspar. Jerome and Augustine, on the other hand, thought the Magi were from Babylon. Meanwhile, Justin Martyr, Tertullian, Cyprian of Carthage and Clement of Rome proposed Arabia. In the geography of the ancient world, Arabia was often referred to as being in the east, even though it lies to the southeast of the Holy Land. For Matthew, the exact location doesn't matter nearly as much as the theological point. These wise men are not Jews. Already in chapter 2, he is striking a note that will sound throughout his gospel. Gentile wise men earnestly seek the newborn King of the Jews, while the Jewish leadership in Jerusalem shows no enthusiasm at all. And this theme bookends Matthew's entire gospel. At the very end, the risen Christ sends out his disciples with the Great Commission. Go therefore and make disciples of all nations, baptize them in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Spirit. Thus, the gospel begins with Gentiles coming to Jesus and ends with Jesus sending his disciples to the Gentiles. These two stories form a fitting set of bookends to Matthew's message. The good news of the Messiah is for all nations. Let's see what else we can find out about the Magi. Do we know when they arrived in Jerusalem? We have one very definite time marker. They met King Herod. We know that Herod died in 4 BC. New Testament scholar Raymond Brown tells us that a birth of Jesus dated 2 years before the death of Herod in 4 BC would be consonant with the information in Luke chapter 3 verse 23 that Jesus was about 30 years of age in the 15th year of the reign of Tiberius Caesar, a year reckoned at October AD 27 to October AD 28. The story of the Magi is found only in Matthew's Gospel, and it is told in 6 short scenes. Scenes 1, 2 and 3 are set in Jerusalem, and scenes 4, 5 and 6 are set in Bethlehem. In scene 1, we're told that the Magi came from the east to Judea looking for the King of the Jews. They arrive at Herod's palace in Jerusalem, which they presume must be the place where the newborn King of the Jews would be found. In scene 2, Luke tells us that Herod hears of this. This news, Magi seeking the King of the Jews, would certainly have startled Herod. After all, he was the King of the Jews. When Herod hears of a potential rival, he asks the chief priests and scribes where the Messiah is to be born. Herod's own wise men answer the question immediately, quoting the prophet Micah, "Bethlehem, in the land of Judah." In today's gospel, there is a quiet but devastating contrast between 2 sets of wise men in this story: the Magi from the east and the chief priests and scribes in Jerusalem. The chief priests and scribes know the scriptures inside out. They can quote Micah chapter 5 verse 2 without hesitation. They live only a few kilometres from Bethlehem. Everything they need to recognize God's action is right in front of them. And yet they do nothing. Why? Perhaps because to go to Bethlehem would mean admitting that God is doing something new, something they cannot control. It is easier to stay where they are, safe in familiar routines, than to risk the unsettling change that a newborn Messiah might bring. Meanwhile, the Magi, foreigners, outsiders, have travelled hundreds of kilometres across deserts, simply because they have caught the faintest glimmer of God's light. The ones who know the most stay at home in fear. The ones who know the least step forward in faith. We can all ask ourselves, do we cling to what is familiar, or do we allow God to draw us out of our comfort and into the journey where Christ is found? I have in mind the words of the poet W.H. Auden from The Age of Anxiety. We would rather be ruined than changed. We would rather die in our dread than climb the cross of the moment and let our illusions die. And of course, we can all be guilty of that. In scene 3, Herod passes the information he has received from the chief priests and scribes to the Magi and asks for their cooperation. Go and search diligently for the child, and when you have found him, bring me word, so that I may also go and pay him homage. In scene 4, the Magi emerge from the shadow of Herod and follow a star to Bethlehem. Bethlehem was, of course, where David was brought up and anointed king of Israel by the prophet Samuel. Matthew presents Jesus as the son of David. Matthew begins his gospel with a long list of names, Jesus' family tree, starting all the way back with Abraham. He does this to make a point. The story of Jesus begins with the story of God's people. Everything God has been doing through Abraham, through the great King David, and through all the generations of Israel has been leading to Jesus. Matthew also arranges the list in a pattern of 3 groups of 14 generations. The sum of the generations is therefore 14 from Abraham to David, 14 from David to the Babylonian deportation, and 14 from the Babylonian deportation to the Messiah. So Matthew presents 14 generations from Abraham to David, 14 generations from David to the Babylonian exile, and 14 generations from the exile to the birth of Jesus, who is called the Messiah. We could say that there's a coded message here. Ancient Hebrews did not use Arabic numerals. The letters of the Hebrew alphabet had numerical values. The name David is made up of 3 consonants, Daleth, Vav, Daleth. Daleth is the 4th letter, so a value of 4. Vav, the 6th, a value of 6. Since ancient Hebrew was written without vowels, the numerical value of David is 4 plus 6 plus 4, which equals 14. Matthew's threefold structure is therefore not accidental or random. It is his way of saying that the entire sweep of Israel's story, from Abraham through David, through exile, reaches its long-awaited fulfillment in Jesus, the Son of David. He is the new David who comes to end Israel's exile and save his people from their sins. In scene 5, the Magi's long journey ends as they enter the house, find the child with Mary his mother, and pay homage to the child. It's worth noticing that Matthew's story of the Magi doesn't take place in a stable. When the Magi arrive, Matthew says they come into the house, which tells us that, in his account, Mary and Joseph are not passing travellers, but are living in Bethlehem. This small detail serves an important purpose. By placing the scene in an ordinary home rather than a rustic stable, Matthew emphasizes that God's revelation comes quietly, within the ordinary patterns of life, and that even in such an everyday setting, Jesus is recognized and worshipped as the true King. We're told that the Magi fall down and worship the child. The verb that Luke uses here is proskuneo. It literally means to fall down before, to prostrate oneself, or to bow in reverence. In classical Greek, it can describe gestures of respect toward a superior. However, in the Septuagint, it becomes the standard verb for the worship owed to the God of Israel, appearing in context where physical bowing expresses inward devotion, surrender, and acknowledgement of divine authority. So proskuneo carries both a physical and a theological dimension. It describes outward posture, kneeling, bowing, or prostration, and the inner attitude of reverence, adoration, and submission. When applied to Jesus, particularly in Matthew's Gospel, it conveys something far stronger than homage to a human king. It conveys an act ordinarily reserved for God. Matthew uses this same verb in the final scene of the Gospel set on a mountain in Galilee. When the disciples see Jesus, they worship him. So Matthew uses this same verb for worship at the very start and the very end of his Gospel, and he does this on purpose. In today's Gospel, the Magi from faraway lands bow down and worship the child Jesus, an act that, in the Bible, is meant for God alone. Then, in the final chapter of the Gospel after the resurrection, the disciples also worship Jesus on a mountain in Galilee. By repeating this verb in these two key moments, Matthew is sending a clear message. The baby who received worship in Bethlehem is the same risen Lord who receives worship at the end of the story. The Gospel opens with people from the nations coming to honour him, and it closes with Jesus sending his followers out to all the nations. Matthew is quietly but firmly teaching that Jesus is truly divine, God with us, from the beginning, and the Lord who is with us always at the end, and that worshipping him is the right response for everyone. Pope Benedict offers this reflection. The wise men do a proskunesis before the royal child. That is to say, they throw themselves onto the ground before him. This is the homage that is offered to a divine king. The gifts brought by the wise men may be explained in similar terms. They are not practical gifts of a kind that the Holy Family might have had a use for at this moment. They express the same thing as the proskunesis. They acknowledge the royal dignity of him to whom they are offered. Gold and incense are also mentioned in Isaiah chapter 60 verse 6 as gifts of homage that the Gentiles will place before the God of Israel. The gifts of gold, frankincense, and myrrh offered by the Magi are rich in symbolism and have long been understood as revealing who Jesus is and what his mission will be. Gold is the gift for a king, acknowledging Jesus as the royal son of David. Frankincense, a costly resin used in temple worship, points to his divine identity and his role as the one who brings God's presence to his people. Myrrh, a perfume used both in healing and in burial. foreshadows the suffering and death he will endure for the salvation of the world. John's Gospel tells us quite explicitly that when Jesus is taken down from the cross, Nicodemus had brought with him a mixture of myrrh and aloes. Together, these gifts proclaim Jesus as King, God, and suffering Saviour, a child who was born not only to rule, but also to offer his life in love. Now, you will have noticed that Matthew never calls the Magi kings, nor does he tell us how many of them there were. Christian tradition eventually settled on 3 Magi, almost certainly because 3 gifts are mentioned. But how did these visitors become kings in Christian imagination? As Christians pondered Matthew's story, other biblical texts naturally came to mind. The first is Isaiah chapter 60 verses 1 to 6, today's first reading. There we hear, "The nations come to your light, and kings to your dawning brightness, bringing gold and incense, and singing the praise of the Lord." Matthew never quotes this directly as a fulfillment text, but it quietly hovers in the background, especially with its reference to kings and its mention of gold and incense. The second text is Psalm 71, today's responsorial psalm. Once again, we meet kings. "The kings of Tarshish and the seacoast shall pay him tribute. The kings of Sheba and Seba shall bring him gifts. Before him all kings shall fall prostrate. All nations shall serve him." These are Gentile kings, and they're coming from far-off lands, Tarshish in Spain, Sheba in Yemen, and Seba in Ethiopia. All this resonates deeply with how Matthew begins his Gospel, the genealogy of Jesus Christ, son of David. And who was the most famous son of David? Solomon, Israel's wise and glorious king. In the first book of Kings, chapter 10, the Queen of Sheba travels a great distance to visit Solomon. She came to Jerusalem with a very great retinue, with camels bearing spices, and very much gold and precious stones. After hearing his wisdom, she says, "The report was true that I heard in my own land, but I did not believe it until I came and my own eyes had seen it." Matthew himself refers to this very scene later in his Gospel. Jesus tells the Pharisees who are demanding a sign from him, "The Queen of the South came from the ends of the earth to hear the wisdom of Solomon, and see, something greater than Solomon is here." So when we place Matthew's account of the Magi alongside Isaiah chapter 60, Psalm 71, and chapter 10 of the first book of Kings, the message becomes clear. In this child, the nations recognize one who is greater than Solomon, one who is the true Son of David, in whom the glory of God now appears. We now come to the final scene. In scene 6, the Magi leave Bethlehem, being warned in a dream not to return to Herod. The Magi returned home by another road, Matthew tells us. They, of course, wanted to avoid meeting Herod again. But there was surely something else at play here. They could not go back the same way, because an encounter with Christ always changes the direction of our lives. These learned searchers who had travelled so far following a faint star went home with something far greater than the gifts they had brought. They carried a new vision, a new understanding of what God is doing in the world. Their return journey invites us to ask, what happens after we meet Christ? Do we simply resume life as before, or does his presence alter our path, our choices, our priorities, our patterns of thought? Like the Magi, we are called to let the grace of that encounter reshape our way home, to walk differently, act differently, love differently. Their story tells us that genuine worship leads to genuine change, and that those who truly find the Lord cannot help but travel by a new road.